Well, hey everybody, thank you so much for hanging out with me for Grow a Little Wednesdays. So this is going to be something that our church is going to be doing, that we're going to be doing together and joining together every Wednesday night at 7. And then if you can't catch it live Wednesday night at 7, we're going to be putting it on our YouTube channel just so you can check it out. And what I really wanted to do is I really wanted to have, during this time where we're exclusively meeting online, I wanted to have kind of almost like a little midweek leadership lesson that I wanted to get to you. And so maybe you're a pastor watching from a different church, or maybe you're somebody that goes to our church that's watching, or maybe you're somebody that goes to a different church, or maybe you don't go to church at all. Really the goal of this is to help us all grow a little bit on these Wednesdays. And one of my favorite things to talk about is leadership. And so during these times, we're going to talk a lot about leadership. And I really wanted to start this by talking about something that I am really, really passionate about. And that is this whole idea of the fact that you and I, we are all both leaders and we are followers. And in fact, if I were to title this little leadership talk, I would call it Led and Leading. Led and Leading. And I just really believe that a huge part of leadership is asking ourselves this question: how can I lead people better? Whether that's in my home life or in the workplace or fellow students, how can I lead people better? A follow-up question to ask yourself that can help you get to that answer, how do I lead people better, is to ask yourself, how do I enjoy being led? What gets the most out of me? And I don't think we need to look any further when we ask ourselves that question than the way that God leads us. In fact, I think the thing that can help your leadership, help my leadership, is leading like Jesus. I think if we aspire to lead like Jesus, I think we will get a lot more out of the people around us. So I just wanted to highlight really 5 things and 5 ways in which God leads us that we ought to take upon ourselves in our own leadership that can help us get the most out of the people around us. So the first one is this: how does God lead us? First of all, He leads us with belief. He leads us with belief. I am so grateful that God sees things in me. You ought to be grateful and encouraged by the fact that, when God sees you, He sees you with incredible gifts. He sees you with incredible potential. He sees you with even a greater capacity in which you see yourself. And so when God leads us and He calls us, in fact, when you read the scriptures, it is laced with language of people that do not believe in themselves, and yet Jesus, and in the Old Testament, right, before Jesus, God really speaks life over people, right? Remember when He tells Moses is insecure, he's not sure about his leadership, he's not sure about his ability to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. What does God do? God doesn't say you can't. God speaks life over him and equips him with the things that he needs to do what God was calling him to do. So God always starts with building belief in you. And so I just think as a leader, man, I got to continually build belief in people. I got to continually encourage them. In fact, I used to be really, really bad at telling people what I've thought about them. In fact, I'm one of those people, man, I just love people. I see great things in people all the time. But years ago, I used to be really bad at communicating that. Like some of you, you see great things in people, you think high thoughts of people, and yet you rarely communicate those things. So I would encourage you, one of the greatest things that you can give the people around you is a confidence. And the way you give them confidence is by speaking belief over them. So God speaks belief over us. It would stand to reason that you and I ought to be speaking belief over other people. The other way that God leads us is that He leads us with grace. He leads us with grace. I am so grateful, as the Bible says, that God does not deal with me as my sins deserve, but He removes them as far as the east is from the west. Now, the reality is, in leadership, in parenting, and in whatever you're doing, marriage, you're going to have difficult, potentially awkward conversations. And what I just have always found is, man, if you lace those conversations in language of grace, you're just going to go a lot further when it comes to your leadership. The other thing that I would say, a huge part of giving grace is really putting people in roles that are appropriate for where they are. I think sometimes it's graceless to put people in positions that it would be really difficult for them to succeed and then get frustrated at them when they don't succeed. And so a huge thing that we're always trying to do in our church is to put people and to get people early wins in levels of leadership that they have been graced for and that is appropriate for them. The stuff that is a toss-up, the stuff that could go either way, the stuff that could go really, really bad, I actually give those assignments to proven people that can handle if it doesn't work out. And so I would encourage you, a huge part of grace is setting people up to win. Continually coach people, but do it with grace. That's what God does for us, and that's what we should be doing for other people. Another way that God leads us is that he leads us with authority. He leads us with authority. God doesn't lead us passively, so you shouldn't lead others passively. God doesn't speak, in terms of if you want to. God speaks with authority. Can I just encourage you in this, whether you're a parent, whether you're leading an organization, whether you're leading a small group of people, whether you're leading a city group at our church, whether you're a pastor watching this, people don't follow insecure leaders for a long time. They follow people that are secure. They follow people that are confident, and they follow people that lead within the measure of authority that God has given them. What's amazing about that is you can rest assured every position that God has given you, every title that God has given you, every environment that God has put you in, you are in that room because God wanted you to be in that room. I tell our staff that all the time. I tell our interns that all the time. I tell the people of our church that all the time. You don't have to step into a meeting and be insecure and unsure. You get to step into those meetings with the authority that Christ has put on your life, with the authority of the believer. And you get to step in those environments and go, I'm only here because the grace of God wanted me to be here. So I might as well be fully present, operating in the max capacity in my gifts. I would encourage you in this next season, take even greater ownership. Take even greater ownership of the areas in which God has put in your hands, over your area, over your people, over your culture, over your approach. Take great ownership. Another way that God leads us, that we ought to lead people with in the same way, is with expectation. With expectation. Another way of saying that is God leads us with high standards. God leads us with high standards. Does anybody ever feel like God leads you with low standards? No, we don't think that. Like whenever God speaks to me, whenever God is challenging me in the areas of leadership, in the areas of how I'm operating as a follower of Him, it's never ever with low standards. Now He gives me grace, which we already talked about, but He always leads me with high standards. I always feel like God, this sense that God is saying, man, Andrew, there's more in you. There's more in you. There's more in you. So if we think that God leads us with high standards and God leads us with these awesome visions, why do we put so low expectations and put such low standards on the people that we lead? It's one of those things that never has made sense to me. In fact, I'm a firm believer in this. Oftentimes, people will rise to the level of the expectation that is put on them. And so I'm just a firm believer that I would encourage you to put greater expectation. Like at our church, listen, if you're a volunteer, it's hard to have like key roles if you can't show up on time. It's hard to have key roles if you're always calling in last minute to cancel. And so you got to hold people to a high standard because here's what I've just come to realize in ministry. People want to be held to a high standard. Now, they want it done with grace and they want it done with love and compassion. But I'm just a firm believer. I know this to be true of my own life. People are amazing and they respond when you put high expectations. So start by creating. Now, this is really big. High expectations are layered. So you got to start by placing high expectations on yourself. What will frustrate people is when you put high expectations on them and you have low expectations on yourself. For example, I heard a leader say one time, and by the way, sometimes you hear leaders say things that sound cool, but then when you really think about it, you're like, I don't know if that's a great thing to say. I heard a leader one time say he was late to a meeting. Now, he was the boss, and I'll never forget, he said this. He goes, I've never been late to my own meeting. And what he was saying is pretty much the meeting starts when I show up. And now, listen, that sounds cool, man. That sounds like super Bruce Willis. That sounds awesome. But the reality is, what a terrible precedent to set. And if you don't put expectations on yourself of showing up on time, if you don't put expectation on yourself of doing things with excellence and being prepared, then people won't listen to you. You'll eventually lose, you won't have credibility, and you'll lose the ability to hold people to high standards if you do not have high standards for yourself. So when you're layering these expectations, man, they gotta start with yourself. And then finally, I think a way God leads us, which in turn, man, we got to lead people in the same way, is that God leads us with a picture. He leads us with a picture. God is a God of vision, right? To go back to Moses, when he talked to Moses, what did he talk about? He talked about Moses leading people out of slavery. He led them with a picture. When Jesus came onto the scene, right, he talked about setting us free from our chains and things of that nature. What is that, man? That's a picture. This is why Jesus spoke so much in terms of illustrations, because he would always paint this picture. Now listen, leadership has to be about more than filling slots. It has to be more about than just filling slots. One of the things that we always encourage our team is that, listen, we don't need a kids teacher for the 9 a.m. service for the 2-year-olds. What we need somebody that has been called by God and is equipped by God to teach the Bible to young people so that their lives can be transformed forever. And if that's at the 9 o'clock, great. If that's at the 10:45, great. But we got to make sure that we're not building our churches or building our ministries off of, this reality that says, we need to fill these slots. Because here's what I know. Filling slots, it's not inspiring. Filling slots is not inspiring. Giving people and painting people a picture of the difference that their lives could mean, that is inspiring. And so, I think a huge part of this is when you're talking to people, when you're leading people, when you're encouraging people, is to do everything you can to paint a picture of what the future could look like. So I just want to encourage you in leadership. The reality is you're probably doing better than you think you are. And what I would just say, I think a lot of times I talk to a lot of people about leadership. And often the thing that I come back to is be what has caused you to respond. And I think sometimes it's just so easy to forget that when we're trying to become a better leader, to just pause and go, well, how does God operate, and how is God trying to lean into my own life and get the most out of me? And that's really what this talk is all about, is the fact that you and I were led by God, and God leads us in such a way that is, by the way God leads is perfect. And that is the aspiration, right? That is what we're going for, is to become like Christ. The Apostle Paul talked about spiritual formation being that we are becoming like Christ. And let's not just become like Christ in our character. Yeah, that's huge. Let's also become like Christ in our leadership. And let's be reflective of the way that Christ has led us, so that we can lead other people in a succinct and a helpful way. Well, man, I love you. Can't wait to continue to grow. Can't wait to get into all the stuff that we're going to get into. By the way, even as you're watching this, if you have some questions, I am going to be online on these Wednesdays watching this as well. And maybe if there are questions that arise out of this, please chat with me on gracecity.com, and I'd love to have as much conversation as we possibly can, or maybe send me an email, and we can kind of maybe discuss some of this stuff. But thank you so much for joining us, and can't wait to see you this Sunday at church, where we're live streaming all of our services at 9, 10:45, 12:30, and 6. And then next Wednesday night, 7 o'clock. Love you. Can't wait to see you again.